Okay, well, you guys, hello and welcome to the B&H event space. I'm so happy to be here. I'm Sandra Coan, and I am a newborn and family photographer from Seattle, Washington. And I also happen to be a film photographer. I shoot exclusively with film in my studio, and I'm very, very passionate about it. So thank you all for being here with me today. That's me. Again, Sandra, and I've been doing this photography thing for a very long time. This is actually, I'm going into my 20th year as a professional photographer, so a very long time. So I'm one of those people who started in film photography because that's all we had, right? And then I moved to digital photography around 2007 when that all happened. And then decided to move back around 2011. Now, when I made the switch in 2007, I kind of got on that bandwagon because I believed, like a lot of people did, that film was dying and this is where the industry was going, and if I was going to be able to make it and keep my business going that I'd worked so hard to start, this is what I had to do. But I kind of figured out right away that digital wasn't a good fit for me. It just was so different. I felt like I had to completely relearn everything I knew about photography, the way I metered things, how I lit things, all of that. And also I just really, really hated the amount of post-production that I was suddenly doing. I felt like I had gone from being a photographer to being someone who works on their computer. And while some people love that, I did not. That's not where I shine. That's not my zone of genius, as they say. So what happened is I stopped photographing for fun. And I would go to work and I would pick up my digital camera, and it very much felt like work. It wasn't fun. And then I would do all the post-production and that stuff. I even started hiring it out. Still wasn't fun. But then I would go home and I would never pick up my camera because it felt like work, and I didn't want to have to sit on the computer. And as a result, I stopped photographing my own children, who were little at the time, and that was kind of sad. So I decided one day, I was like, this is just dumb. I need to photograph my own kids. I'm just going to pick up my film cameras and just do it the way I know, and at least it'll get done, and I'll enjoy it again. So I started photographing my family. I don't normally let my children run around with saws and things, but he just looked so darn cute. And what happened quickly is not only was I photographing my family again, I was enjoying it. I was excited. I would go and I'd get out my cameras, I'd load them with film, and it felt really fun. And the more I did it, the more fun I had, the more joy I started having in my work again, the more I started thinking, like, well, maybe this is something that I should be doing at work as well. And so I started practicing on my kids in my studio, trying to, learn that all again. And then I just decided around 2011, all right, I'm done. I'm going to do it in my studio work as well. So I went back to film full-time 2011, and now I shoot exclusively in film in my studio. That's all I do. Here's a little bit of my work. I work with babies, obviously, but right, like super pretty, fun, easy. Now, I always tell people when they ask me about this process, like, why on earth did you do that? That coming back to film and making that choice in my life was like the best decision I ever made, because I had fun again. I enjoyed photography again. But really making that decision in my business as well as a professional photographer also was like one of the best business decisions I've ever made. And what's exciting about that is that I'm not alone in that. Over the past few years, I think we've all seen film really coming back in. This medium that we all once thought was dead, is really on the rise. And there's a lot of professional photographers who are doing exactly what I did, which is getting rid of all their digital gear and going back to film. And so that's exciting. That means that film is alive and well, which is important for me, because the more people work with it, they're going to keep making it, and I can keep shooting it. So that's a big deal. But what I also want to say is that you don't have to be a professional photographer to shoot film. Film is for everyone. It's really fun, it's really accessible, and it's just really easy. Like honestly, my kids shoot it. They're little hipsters running around with their Holgas. So that's what we're going to do today, okay? Is I'm just going to show you how easy and how fun and how accessible it is. So let's do this. Now, I believe that to shoot film well and successfully, there's really just 3 things that you need to know, okay? You need to know your light, know how to see it, know how to meter for it. We're going to talk about that today. You need to know your film. Each of the film stocks is a little bit different, so we're going to get into that today. And then you also need to know your lab, because unless you are processing and scanning your film on your own, which some people do, I totally don't, I'm kind of lazy, then your lab is really, really important. So this is what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to walk you through all 3 of these things: know your film, know your light, know your film, know your lab. And so my goal is that by the end of this class, you might not know everything you need to know to go out and shoot film, but you'll know the most important pieces so that you'll be able to go right downstairs, get yourself some film, and go out and shoot on this beautiful day here in New York. So whenever I start talking about film and that I'm a film photographer, I get this question all the time, like, why on earth would you do that? And I get it from my clients, I get it from other photographers, so I just want to answer that really quick before we get started. Yes, there are a lot of drawbacks to shooting film on the surface, right? It's slow. It is. You have to load your camera, especially like I work with kids, right? So I have 16 frames and then I have to put in a new roll. It's slower than digital for sure. I kind of like that though. It's expensive. This is what I hear all the time. And I mean, I guess it's expensive because you don't just buy one card and just keep using that same card, but it's really not that expensive. We'll talk about that too. And then of course you have a fixed ISO. There's no bumping up in the middle of a shoot and dealing with that kind of stuff. And then you have to wait to see your results. And I'll admit, that wait used to be excruciating for me. Like you spend all this time, you shoot it, you can't see it, and then you send it off to the lab and it's like 2 weeks before you get it back. Now I love it. But there's also like a lot of really great things about film that make it just fun. So first of all, there's the film itself. What's great about film and film stocks is that there is no universal standard for film. Each stock is a little bit different. They each have their own color profile, their grain profile, the way you work with it's a little bit different. And for me, that's exciting because that takes me into a place of creation where I get to decide how I want my images to look, and then I get to choose the film stock, to get that look. It's sort of like the way a painter would choose to work with watercolor or oil paints, right? So for me, it's fun. It's putting the art back into my work. And I know that like digital presets and stuff are really popular in the digital crowd. I always tell people that like a little film canister, a little roll of film is like a little preset, because each one is a little different. They each have their own color profile, their own grain profile, so it makes learning about them really fun. I also really like the cameras. They're just pretty. I mean, like I saw your Leica when I came in, and they're pretty, they're fun. I shoot with a Rolleiflex at my studio, which is the twin lens. They look weird. Like, little kids come into my studio and they're like, what is that? And I've instantly got their attention. It's like nothing they've seen before. But they're also fun to work with. And it means that my images look different. My photos don't look like everybody else in my market because I'm using different cameras, because I'm using film, because they have that texture. A lot of times my clients come in and they say, gosh, there's something about your photos, I don't know what it is, but they really stand out. I'm like, well, I know what it is. Thank you very much. But the cameras, they're fun, they're pretty. The other great thing about film is it's really, really easy. You really just put it in your camera, do a few things I'm going to show you today, and you're done. You just do it all the way the Lord intended. None of this on the computer time, which brings me to my last point, that it has freed me from the computer. And for me, this has been huge. What used to take me hours in post-production literally takes me 5 minutes. I actually have a video on my YouTube channel where I show editing and a complete session, and it's literally like, I think 7 minutes. So it's great. So that means for me that I get to do things like see my family and have free time, which is awesome. But I also can work with more clients. because I'm not spending all this time in post, and that's good for my business. So there's a lot of reasons to love film. And yes, the limitations can feel scary, but if you just trust the process, you're going to love it. Okay? So let's get started. 3 things you need to know, and we're going to start with know your light. All right? And first we're going to talk about the difference between film and a digital sensor. So if you were to like Google this, like film versus digital sensor, you'd probably get tons of articles telling you why one is better than the other. I personally don't believe one is better than the other, but they are really, really different. And the biggest difference is in exposure latitude. So when you're working with a digital camera, everybody here is, I'm assuming, has shot with a digital camera or has some experience with that. When you're working with a digital camera, it's easy to, if you overexpose, to blow your highlights and lose detail, right? We've all experienced that. And in fact, digital photographers will often err on the side of underexposure a little bit, just so that they don't lose the detail in their highlights, right? It's kind of a thing. Whereas the opposite is true with film. Now with film, film has tremendous exposure latitude. I'm going to show you that. I've even, on purpose, overexposed film 5-6 stops just to see, and you don't ever lose your detail. It's kind of amazing. But you go under, you underexpose it, and it turns into a big muddy mess. So they literally are opposites. And here's an example of what I'm talking about. So the top one was shot on my Canon 5D Mark II. Now I will say that digital cameras are getting better all the time, but you still run into this problem of, you know, losing detail in your highlights. And you can see, like at that perfect exposure, everything looks great, but even at +1, it's starting to get bright. By over 2, you're losing detail, and by 3, it's really starting to get washed out. If we were to overexpose that 5 stops, I mean, his face would be gone. And we've all had that, right? But on the underexposed side, those all look pretty good. You could still work with them. Now look at the film test. So at +1, looks great. +2, looks great. +3, it looks great. We're not losing any detail. We're not blowing any highlights. But as we go into the underexposure side, you're starting to see some color shifts and some unwanted grain, which is what happens with film. So they really are opposite. Here's another example. This is my posing doll. She features prominently in a lot of my education work. Sorry. But so this one is a 10-stop exposure test. And I went 5 stops over. And you can see, even at 5 stops, we haven't lost any detail, right? Isn't that amazing? And again, as we get into the underexposure side, it starts looking kind of muddy and gross. Now, a lot of people think that because film has this huge exposure latitude, that you can just overexpose it all day and it's never going to be a problem, which I guess is kind of true. But what there's this whole belief system around how exposure affects your image that I want to clear up right now. So a lot of people believe that if you overexpose your film, that's how you get that kind of light, airy look. And that makes sense if we're thinking like a digital photographer, right? Because if you're working with digital, the more you overexpose, the brighter the image gets. But that's actually not necessarily true with film. So I want to show you this really quick. So these 2 images were shot at the exact same time, metered exactly the same way, and I metered them to be about 3 stops overexposed off of what my box speed reading was. And you can see digital's blown, film is not, right? So now I want to go back to this really quick. So, okay, so the whole idea of if you overexpose your film, you're going to get that bright and airy look. That's not true. You can see here that at 3 stops over and at 5 stops over, the brightness on those images is the same. There's a little bit of a color shift between the 2, and I'll talk to you about that. But the brightness level, that's all the same, all right? So if overexposure doesn't affect the brightness of it, what does it do? That's what we want to talk about. So The answer goes like this. I don't want to lose anybody here, but so when you overexpose a digital sensor, what happens is you lose information on that sensor, which is why you're blowing your highlights. Again, opposite is true with film. When you overexpose your film negative, you're actually adding information to your negative to a point. It's called film density. And so it'll look like this. Do you see how as we go into overexposure, that negative is getting darker and darker and darker and darker? Because it's more light, it's getting exposed. But what's happening, I wish I had a pointer. I feel like I need, if I stand over here. But what's happening is as you get into that the little bit of that overexposure part, if you look closely at that negative, and I'll pull it up here, what you can see is that you're adding information at overexposure. You have information in the highlights and the shadows, which is what you want. That's having a really good dense negative. Whereas when you're underexposing, if you look at that one that's -2, you're losing information. You can see that there's not that information in the shadows, right? That you're losing that shadow detail. Now, because of that, because you always want to be starting with the best negative you can, you want to make sure that the negative you're working with has as much information as possible in the shadows and the highlights. And so to get that, you want to make sure you're metering in such a way that you're getting that shadow detail. So and by doing that, you are going to overexpose your highlights a little bit, but you're never going to lose detail because film's awesome. And so you get that really nice, thick, dense negative. Does that make sense? So the question is then, well, how do you know how to meter to make sure you're getting that nice shadow detail and your highlights are at an acceptable level? Well, you do that by metering. So I brought my handy little meter. This is the only piece of equipment that I brought with me. As film photographers, you guys, having a handheld light meter is probably the best piece of equipment that you can have. And these little handheld light meters, so if you guys all worked with one before, if not, I'll show you. These are really the best little piece of equipment that you can have. And it's your meter's job to make sure wherever you're reading is placed at middle gray, right? So middle gray, really quick, we won't get into the whole zone system, but it's a term from the zone system that was coined by Ansel Adams, where the zones, there's 11 zones, one being absolute white, one being absolute black. That zone 5, middle gray, is the perfect middle spot between those two, right? And every meter and every camera that is made with that in mind. So when you meter, wherever you're placing your meter, wherever you're doing your reading, that's going to be brought to middle gray, and then everything falls into place from there. Does that make sense? So when we're metering for film, if we get our shadows at middle gray, then our highlights will fall accordingly. So how does the meter work if you've never worked with one before? You basically just put in 2 points of the exposure triangle and the meter will give you the third. So if you're reading for natural light, you put in your ISO and your aperture, and then the meter will give you your shutter speed. If you're working with studio lighting, you put in your ISO and your shutter speed or your sync speed, and it will give you the aperture. Now there's 2 different ways to take a meter reading, reflective and incident. Reflective metering means that your meter is reading the light that is reflecting off your subject. So it's coming here, it's bouncing back and into the meter. That's great. That's what your camera does when you're in spot meter mode, for example. The problem with reflective metering, however, is that it really does depend on the tones that light is reflecting off of. So a good example of that is if you're at a wedding and you have a white wedding dress and a black tuxedo, they're in the same light, you're going to get a different reading off of the black tuxedo than you will off the white dress, right? And you can work with gray cards, you can do things to get around that. But I like things easy, and so I use incident metering. And incident metering reads the light that is falling on your subject as opposed to the light that is reflecting off your subject. And it's really easy and really, really straightforward. That's how I meter all my film, and so that's what I'm going to be showing you today when we get into how you meter for film to make sure you're getting that really good dense negative. All right? So metering for color film. There are slight differences between metering for color film, metering for black and white film, and now metering for slide film. So when you're metering for color film, you want to be using incident metering, and you want to make sure that you are really getting in there and metering for that dark shadow. Now, the reason for that is, again, is if you are reading, if your meter is saying here is zone 5, right? So that's the darkest part of your image, and the darkest part of your image is going to be at that perfect exposure, and the highlights are usually going to be about 2 to 3 stops over, which again is completely acceptable for film, right? So color film, you want to meter for your shadows. Make sure that those deep dark shadows are perfectly exposed. If not, sometimes in tricky situations you'll get photos that look underexposed. This happened to me when I first started shooting film again. I was like, what is going on? Why is it that sometimes my photos look muddy when I'm in kind of tricky light situations? Like this one is backlit with the light coming through the windows. And that was because I wasn't really getting in there with my meter and making sure that that really deep dark shadow was at middle gray. And so because of that, let's just go back, my shadows were getting a little underexposed. So it's really, really important with color film in particular to make sure that those dark shadows are metered properly. So this one I didn't, and then I got really down in there with my meter, and you can see the difference, how that looks. So what does it look like when you meter for your shadow? So you have your meter all set. I always do bulb out. There's always this question about bulb out or bulb in. I do bulb out, and I just literally get in the shadow. So if this is my light and it's hitting me here, this is my highlight, this is my shadow, I do bulb facing into the shadow. I don't do this, all right? Because if I do this, this is going to end up being more of a mid-tone reading, because it is going to pick up some of those highlights. So you want to turn your bulb so it's facing into the shadow. So again, that darkest part of your image is going to be at middle gray, perfectly exposed. Does anybody have any questions about that? Metering can be confusing. Now, the other question I always get when I start talking about metering and how to meter for color film is, well, does it matter what kind of light you're in? And the answer is no. Metering like this, it's super straightforward, it's really easy, and it works in all lights. So here we have, this image was on a gray overcast Seattle day. This is Portra 400. And again, I metered for the shadows. Now, when you have that kind of soft light on those overcast days, sometimes it's hard to know where those shadows are, but you can always find them. I always just kind of guess it. There's a lot of wiggle room in film, as we saw, so on days like this, it's a little easier. But then we have days like this where we're in big, bright sun, and again, I'm metering for those shadows. So here on the mom, that would be right down here, kind of under her neck, chin area, making sure that that darkest part is perfectly exposed. And you can see we're not losing any detail in the highlights, which is so great. Yeah?
Where'd you point the bulb to on her neck, mom's neck? You pointed it.
Oh wait, now in this situation, you do want to be careful when you're out in the world, because obviously if you're like on a beach or you're standing on something, if you're accidentally here, it's going to be picking up that light. So just really pay attention, make sure you're in there at that darkest part of the image so that you're getting that enough light in that shadow piece. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Okay, I lost you.
Okay, it's okay. Metering's tricky.
So we're talking about incident here.
Yes.
All right. So I remember from years backwards here
Yeah.
that you'd go to your subject and point it towards the camera.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah, they used to,
like that.
yeah.
But you're not doing that.
I'm not doing that.
Okay.
Because I'm really wanting to make sure that I'm not ever accidentally underexposing my shadow. And when you're in a tricky situation, like you're backlit, like the where was it, like that, where I'm backlit from the window. Yeah. So normally when you're in kind of like more of like a loop light situation, there's going to be about a 2 to 3 stop difference between your highlights and your shadows. However, when you're really backlit like that, sometimes it's more. It can be as, you know, like a 5 stop difference. So you really want to make sure that that dark part of your image is at middle gray, because the highlights, and you can see the detail in the curtain, right? Like there, like the highlights are brighter because we really overexposed. There's probably a 5 or 6 stop difference in here because I get that's a southern exposure window. But my goal is always to make sure that that darkest part is properly exposed. If you're an even light like that shadow one, you could do this and it would be fine. But when you're in that really contrasty light, you want to make sure that that dark shadow is exposed. Does that help?
Yeah.
Explain? Sure. There's window light, backlit window light, meter for the shadow. And this is how I meter with my studio lighting too, with my strobes. I meter for my shadows. Now, black and white film is a little bit different. It still has a really good latitude, like color film, but it's slightly different. There are instances, depending on the stock you're using, where if you overexpose too much with black and white, you can blow your highlights a little. So this is where that whole know your film piece comes in. We're going to talk about in a minute, because you really do have to understand each individual film stock and what they do. Color film I kind of feel like is indestructible, but black and white film's a little more nuanced. But even here, sadly, this film stock has been discontinued, but it's such a good example I kept it in. You can see that at 3 stops overexposed, we're not losing any detail. And what's fun about black and white film is that even the underexposed images, I think, could still kind of look kind of good. You could even push them in processing, which I'm not getting into today, but you could, and it would bring up those blacks and make it a little richer. So black and white film also has great latitude, but it is a little bit different. And the biggest difference with black and white when it comes to metering is there really aren't the hard rules for metering black and white like there is for color film. When I teach film, I'm always like, color film, meter for your shadows, every time. With black and white film, it's a little more loosey-goosey. And I tell people that you can meter for where you want your detail to be. Remember, your meter is always finding middle gray. So if you want middle gray to be in your highlights, and you want a darker shadow, you want a little more drama, meter for your highlights. If you want that your detail to be in your shadows, you meter for your shadows, and you get a little brighter highlight. And you really see that with black and white film. So here's 2 examples. This is my son. Doesn't he look so excited to be having his picture taken? But you can see when I metered for the shadows, the image is a little bit brighter. It's different than that color film we were looking at. And then again, metered for the highlights, we have a richer shadow. And here's just another example of that. Metered for the highlights, metered for the shadows. It's subtle, but it's there. And again, this is when you are in a trickier lighting situation, then you would really see this. So if you are in that backlit, like a backlit scenario, and you want a silhouette, right? You want to make sure they're really dark outlined, then you would meter for your highlights, and you'd get that really dark one. But if you want a detail in the person's face and they're backlit, then you would meter for your shadows with black and white. Does that make sense? So metering kind of gives you a lot of different control on the final look of your image, especially with black and white. Now, this is new since the last time I gave this presentation, which is metering for slide film. So last year, Kodak Professional Films, Kodak Alaris brought back Ektachrome, which is a slide film, an E6 film. It was one of these film stocks that had been discontinued. They brought it back, and I was lucky enough to be on their beta test team, which was really fun. So I got to play around with it and report back to the company. But slide film has more of a range. It's more similar to what we see with a digital sensor, actually. Whereas like with color film stock, you can overexpose it 6 stops, you're not losing detail in your highlights. With slide film, you will. So, but you can err a little bit on the side of underexposure. So it's almost identical to what we see with a digital sensor. So here you can see box speed is that perfect exposure piece. Oh, and by the way, I'm calling it box speed because when you buy a roll of film and it'll say like Portra 400, Portra 800, that number that's on the box is the ISO essentially of the film. It's the ASA speed. So we call it box speed. So sorry if that's like lingo-y. But that box speed exposure looks really good. And you can see with the Ektachrome, even at overexposed 1, certainly by +2 and 3, you do start losing highlights. And then it goes under, it gets kind of muddy under really quick. So this one you have to be really, really precise with.
So
Yeah.
this acts like digital.
It does. So you want so I meter this like I meter when I'm metering for digital, which I'm going to show you. So when you're metering for Ektachrome, you want to make sure that you are taking what you were talking about, sir, that old school mid-tone reading, right? So you're getting a nice balance between your highlights and your shadows. If you want a little more drama, you can err on the side of metering for the highlights, because you don't want to blow your highlights with this film, and you can. So in this image, that was metered for the highlights because I wanted a little bit of that deep shadow, right? But it very much looks like digital, doesn't it? And same, I metered this one for the highlights because I wanted that pretty dark shadow. And then, that's not me, is it? No, that would be bad. And then with this one I did a mid-tone reading because I wanted to make sure I had detail everywhere. But it's a beautiful film. If you haven't played around with Ektachrome, give it a try because it's really fun. Yeah, we have a question.
So why would you use Ektachrome? I mean, as opposed to film stock, just that you would make prints out of?
Sure. So the question is, why would you choose Ektachrome as opposed to one of the other ones? For fun. I mean, it goes back to what I was saying at the very beginning, you know, that whole, we're going to get into it in a second, by really getting to know your film stocks. Each film stock is really different, and you'll see that I'm going to show them all side by side. Ektachrome I mean, look at the color saturation, is really rich. It has a really different profile than you get from Portra 400, for example, which makes it fun. So it depends on the kind of work, and this is where you start being able to use the film stocks and what you know about them as part of your artistic vision, right? Because if you're wanting to shoot something with that real color saturation, you know, maybe you're doing editorial work, or this film is what you see is what you get, right? Whereas some of the other films, they can kind of interpret colors their own way. This one, it'll give you a true, this is that reading.
I guess I'm thinking old school,
Mhm.
like end product kind of thing, because when I shot film all the time, there were specific usages for slides.
Yeah.
So why did you shoot slides?
Yeah. So nowadays, so she was saying, for if you couldn't hear her, that, you know, back in the day, there were certain reasons why you'd shoot slide film. That, you know, I'm not printing these as a slide, although that would be kind of awesome. Then we could have like a slideshow, which would be fun. We're scanning these the same. So it is a little bit different the way you're looking at them, but it's that retention. It really is so true to life, which is really nice, and it's fun. That's the fun of film, right? So takeaway on that first part is that, you know, metering's important. Go out and get yourself a handheld light meter if you don't have one. When you meter for color film, you want to meter for your shadows. When you meter for black and white film, you want to meter for where you want your detail to be. And when you're metering for slide film, either meter for your highlights or meter for your midtones. All right, do we have any questions about any of that before we go in? Yes.
Not to downplay it, but why, unless you want a super dramatic picture, why won't people use just meter for midtones, like smack in the center?
So she's saying, why don't you always meter for midtones? It depends on the light you're in. Because remember that one slide that I showed you where the shadows were accidentally underexposed? I was metering for midtones. Because I was like you, like where I had learned film, that you just always take a midtone reading. And then all of a sudden I'm like, but why under certain circumstances am I getting images that look underexposed? What's going on? And it was because there was too big a difference between my shadow and my highlight. So a mid-tone reading wasn't giving me enough exposure on the shadow side. So that's why.
Then it won't overexpose the highlights,
It will, technically they'll be overexposed, but you won't lose detail.
because that right now is more important to get the shadows.
Yes. Yeah. You don't want to get those muddy shadows because that kind of ruins the whole look. Yeah. I know, right? It's super different. It's fun.
Like what?
I know. Okay, did that switch? No. All right, so know your light, we've done that. Now let's talk about know your film now. This is the fun part. All right, so now we know how film is different from a digital sensor, and we're talking about latitude and metering and all that kind of stuff. But film is also just different because it's film. So let's talk about, first of all, there's film size. You can, when you're buying film, you can buy 35 millimeter film or 120. It used to be 220, but we can't get that anymore, or 220 film. So let's talk about that for a second. So small format or 35 millimeter film, it's film that looks like that. It comes in a little round canister, and it's called 35 millimeter because that's the size of the negative. It's a small negative, which is why it's called small format. Generally, when you're shooting 35 millimeter, a roll, you're going to get, depending on the roll you buy, between 24 and 36 exposures on a roll, which seems like so much to me now because I shoot medium format. The other really great thing about shooting small format is it's really accessible. It's, you just grab it, you get 36 exposures, you pop it in your camera, and you just go. And the cameras that you use, they feel more like DSLRs that we're used to now. If you have an old SLR, just pop some film in there, it feels like what you're shooting now, and it looks like what you're shooting now, and it's simple and easy. Because it's so simple and easy, I always shoot 35 millimeter when I'm on vacation with my family, because I can just throw in a roll and grab my old camera, and I don't worry about it. It's not like I'm out with the Hasselblad in a canoe or something, right? Which I've also done. But 35 millimeters, really fun and really accessible. Then there's medium format. Now, when I'm in studio, I'm only ever shooting medium format, and that's because you get a bigger negative with medium format, so you get less grain, you get a smoother image. People often comment on how sharp my photos look, especially in the eyes, and it's because I've got these big negatives that I'm working with, and so I get a sharper image. Like I said, medium format's 120 film. You used to have 220 film that had more, you could get more exposures from 220, but sadly most 220 is hard to find these days, unless you're found somebody who has a stash in their freezer. Now, the type of medium format camera you use is going to determine how many exposures you get on a roll of 120. So if you're using a 645 camera, like I use a Hasselblad H2, it's a 645 or a Contax 645, that number 645 refers to the shape of the negative. And so a 645 negative is like that. It's kind of like a little squatty rectangle, and you get those kind of images. So very similar to the shape that we get with a DSLR, that 4x6 shape. Can also work with a 6x6 camera, which will give you those beautiful old-timey square images, the square before Instagram, right? So that's going to be your Rolleiflexes, your old school Hasselblads, that kind of stuff are going to give you those great square negatives. I still shoot with Rolleiflex all the time in my studio, and I love it. And I actually love the square neg because, again, it kind of sets my work apart. It looks different. It's not what people are normally used to getting from photographers, which is really fun. There's also 6x7. So that's the shape of a 6x7 negative. If you have a Pentax 6.7 is a great camera. It's just a little bit longer than that square, but again, it's this really beautiful big negative. Now, oh, I forgot to mention, with a 645, if you're shooting a roll of 120, you're going to get about 16 exposures per roll. When you're shooting 6x6, you're going to get about 12 exposures per roll. And when you're shooting 6.7, you're going to get about 10 exposures per roll. So the 6.7 is the biggest of the negatives in the medium format. And that's what that looks like. And now there's also large format, and that's its whole other class. I'm not even going to get into that there, but if you are interested in large format, I know some really great classes I can recommend, so ask me afterwards. So the other question that we get all the time when we start talking about film is, okay, well, where do you buy it? Right? This is a question I get all the time. Now, believe it or not, you can still, and probably you guys have seen it, you can still go into a drugstore and get consumer grade film stocks in 35 millimeter. Those are still pretty easy to find. But if you want professional grade film stocks, which I recommend because they have that beautiful latitude that we were just talking about, then you really do want to make sure that you are using a really good supplier like B&H, obviously. You can order it online. If you're in store, you can go downstairs. They have a great selection. But making sure you're using a really good supplier is important because the way that film is handled and stored is important. If it's too hot, if it gets exposed to certain things, it can ruin the film, it can shift the colors, you can get weird streaks and stuff. You don't want that. So if you're buying your film online, use B&H or make sure that you're doing your research and you're getting your film from a good supplier. Once you do have it, you want to make sure that you're storing it in a cool, dry place. I keep mine in, I have a little refrigerator at my studio that I keep mine in. But if you have like a cupboard that's cool and dark, you can put it in there too. It doesn't necessarily have to be refrigerated. And then again, you want to be looking for professional grade film stocks. Now, when it comes to professional grade film stocks, there are actually still a lot of choices, especially if you're looking at the Kodak professional films, which is great. I shoot with Kodak film because they have an entire family of film stocks, so you have a lot of choices. I'm going to share those choices with you now. So Portra 160 is a beautiful film. It comes in 35 millimeter and 120, which is great. Now, the entire Portra line, there's Portra 160, Portra 400, Portra 800. We're going to look at all of them in just a minute. They definitely have similarities as far as the skin tones that you get. They tend to be warmer, but within that family of film, there are slight differences that if you're a nerd like me, you will actually sit and study for years, which I do. And Portra 160 has a warmth to it that I feel like is more earthy. Like instead of like a yellow warm, it's more of a brownish warm, which can be really fun if that's what we're trying to bring out, like those kind of earthy tones in your work. With babies and the kind of work I do, it just has this really nice richness to it that I find appealing, very beautiful. So these are just some examples of Portra 160 and some more. You guys are going to get a lot of what my work looks like here. So Portra 400, also a warm tone film, tends to be a little warmer, but this one tends to be warmer on like the yellows. It has more of like a goldeny tone to it, which I find beautiful, especially if you're shooting outside. So if I'm going outside, and it's fall or whatever, I'll usually, gravitate towards the Portra 400 because it does have that goldeny tone. And you can really see that in like her hair. It's just beautiful, but you're still getting those really milky skin tones, which is beautiful. And again, that's that real richness to it that really brings out those warm tones. That's just my kids. I always have to sneak them in because I think they're cute. Now, then there's Fuji 400. So Portra 400 and Fuji 400, they're both 400 speed films. And because they are both 400 speed films, they get compared to each other all the time. And people get very passionate about this debate. If you're on any of the film forums, like you have Team Fuji and you have Team Kodak, and and people just like really dig it. Yeah, it's sort of like Canon versus Nikon, right? They're both beautiful. Fuji 400H is a cooler tone film, though. It's much cooler than the Portra 400. So that's just something to know. So if you like those cooler tones, that's a good film for you. If you like the warmer tones, you might want to lean towards the Portra. But they're both beautiful. But you can really see the difference in the skin tones, huh? Cutie. And there's some more of the Portra, or the Fuji 400. And there's Portra 800. And this is actually my current favorite film. I'm obsessed with this film stock. And the reason why I like it is that it has that richness that you get with the Portras, but it's a little cooler. So you can kind of see it there, especially in the whites. Whereas like Portra 160 has that earthiness. I feel like Portra 400 is a little warmer. Portra 800 just has this subtle coolness, so it's somewhere kind of in between that Portra 400 and the Fuji 400 look, in my opinion. It also has this kind of like peaches and cream quality to it, where you can see the pinks in it, I think, which I find really beautiful. And there it is again. And there it is again. Now, just for fun, I didn't even get into like there's Ektar, there's the Cinestill, there's so many. I just wanted to show you guys the heavy hitters. But just for fun, I did, this is my assistant, Gabby. We went to WPPI and I had Gabby with me, and everybody recognized her from these film tests that I did because we had published them. But so this is fun. So this is like when you're looking at just my work, I know sometimes it just all looks the same, but when you put them side by side like this, you really can see the differences in the film stocks. And they're a little subtle, but they're there. And so that's the fun part when you start getting into really getting to know your film, is deciding which film stock do you want to use, like which appeals to you. What are you photographing, and what's your stock going to be for that particular image, and why? Like it gets kind of I don't know, like I said, it's fun. It's the putting the art back into it, right? Like deciding what you're going to do. But isn't it interesting to see the difference even in the backdrop? And that backdrop is like a gray, like a smoky gray. And you can see it can go real blue, but you can see the tones, the cool to warm, the blues, and all of that in there, which I love. And like I said, my current favorite, because everybody asks, I'm obsessed with Portra 800 right now. And I do shoot this in studio with studio lights, and I do shoot it at 800, even though I'm working with studio lights. And I still meter for my shadows and everything I just told you about. Does anybody have any questions about color film or the varieties or the different kinds or tones? If not, that's fine. Now, oh yes.
But when you meter, first of all, you have your lighting already set up. You know exactly how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a huge learning curve, like to figure out, like how expensive is it to really get in there and start with your 400? Okay, this was too bright. This didn't work. 800. Like how?
Oh, like to figure out which one you like?
Yeah.
Like how expensive is that? Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think, so the question is, how do you know, like how much do you want to invest in learning about your films? I would start by doing your research. Look at people's work you admire, look at the tones that they're getting, something that you like, start paying attention to what they're using and start there. I actually have a blog post that I shared earlier this year that I talked about how I spent an entire year doing this research, because I had been a Fuji shooter for a really long time. And I decided that I knew that film stock really well, and I was always, I'd just done a creative life class where I was teaching about film stocks and all this, and I was like, if I'm going to teach this, I need to really dive in and learn this. And so I spent an entire year only shooting Kodak film. And I spent like 3 months at a time, like this, this quarter I'm only shooting P160, and this quarter I'm only shooting P400, just so I could learn that. Because what you find is with the film stock, it's not like you can just shoot it once and determine, because there's so many things that come into play when you start looking at the final result that you're getting. We're going to talk about labs in just a second, but your lab, who you're using, which scanner you're using, the lab technician, all of that will contribute to the look of your image. So this film piece is just one piece. It's just, there's the light, there's the film, there's the lab. It's just one piece. And so you really do want to spend some time getting to know a film stock. They each have their own little personalities. And so you really just need to spend some time. So I would start shooting something that you see other people using that looks good, and then go from there. And then if for some reason you're like, gosh, this is not quite fitting my vision, or it's not the look that I'm going for, then you switch and you kind of experiment, and then sooner or later you're going to find one that you love, that like fits you. Yeah. Does that make sense? No, black and white film, there's a ton of black and white films also, and I don't shoot with black and white film as much, so I don't know as much about it, but I did want to come in and just share 2 of my faves of the black and white film. So again, the Kodak Professional, the Kodak Alaris company has a ton of black and whites to choose from, and they are bringing film stocks back all the time. My tried and true is that Kodak Tri-X 400. It's just a classic. It's going to give you those real classic black and white tones, you know. It's just pretty. It has a really nice range as far as its latitude. It pushes, we're not getting into that, but the pushing is something you do in processing where you leave it in the negative, or the chemicals a little bit more, and it will add grain and contrast. This film like pushes like a dream. It's a really good, safe choice if you just want to try something that you like want to feel fairly confident that you're not going to accidentally mess up. This is a good one. And it's beautiful, right? Like that, it has that real classic black and white look that I love. So there it is with natural light, there it is with strobe. Really, really pretty. Now another one that I use all the time is the Ilford Delta 3200. It's a 3200 speed film. It is very, very grainy. It has this big chunky grain to it, which I love. You can overexpose this film. As you can see, you'll start losing detail in the highlights. I actually like it overexposed. This is one that I'll play around with and really kind of push it, or push the barriers, not push it in processing, but push what I do with it, just because I like that overexposure. But again, this comes from me getting to know the film. Now, just recently, Kodak just came out with a T-Max 3200 that's currently only available in 35 millimeter. I'm really pushing them for the 120 because I want to try it, because I love that real grainy look that I get with the 3200 film. But it's really pretty. So there it is, overexposed by about 2 stops in studio. Right, isn't it pretty? It has this kind of dreamy quality to it. Here it's overexposed about 3 stops there because I really wanted that glowy feel. But I also shoot this one with my studio lighting all the time. When I'm shooting it in studio, I also overexpose it. This one I rate it at 1600, so I overexpose it a stop. And here I metered for my highlights. So you can really kind of play around with it. When you get to know what your stock is capable of doing, you can kind of experiment and see what look you like. So yeah, it's fun. That's my dad, by the way. Isn't he cute? So any questions about film or film stocks? Yeah.
Do you ever shoot 35 millimeter?
I do. She's asking if I ever shoot 35 millimeter. I will shoot 35 millimeter for my family, like when I'm out on vacation or whatever, or I just want something easy. And it's funny because I'm so used to shooting in studio now with 120, and I shoot a lot on my Rolleiflex. Like these are all on the Rolleiflex. So I get, I'm used to getting like 12 exposure, and then I put in a roll of 35 millimeter and I have 36 exposure, and it's like, will this ever be over? It's a little overwhelming for me sometimes, but I do. Just not professionally. Oh, that said, the Ektachrome that we were talking about earlier, it's also only available in 35 millimeter right now. So when I shoot Ektachrome, I shoot 35 millimeter. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. So the last piece of knowing how to shoot film has to do with your lab. So you need to know your light, know your film, know your lab. As film photographers, the lab that you choose to work with makes a huge impact on the final results, on the way your work looks. Your lab really is your creative partner because they have just as much control over the outcome of your images as you do choosing your film or making sure you're metering. It really is a partnership, so it's very important that you have a really good lab. So, for example, I did this experiment when I was first starting going back to film, where I wasn't sure which lab to use, and I took one negative and I sent it to, I think, 6 different labs. And the results were just vastly different, depending. Can you guess which one was just like the local drugstore? But right, it's really amazing, and it goes to show you, like, the lab technician, the person who's scanning your images, really can make or break an image. Here it is again. So these ones, only one of those was a professional lab. and they're pretty darn different. Because at that time I'd been reading from people, online saying, oh, just take it into Costco or whatever, but don't do that. Who develops it?
Yes.
Oh, I use Richard Photolab. I'll show you in just a minute. Yeah, what they do. Yeah, but it's interesting, right? So these, I'm not going to point out the labs because I don't want to be that person, but right, really different. So then I decided, like, okay, well that wasn't fair because I sent, one of these was a professional lab, and then the rest were like Walgreens or whatever. So then I did the same kind of test where I sent the film to professional labs, all professional labs. Now all of these are beautiful, they're all acceptable scans, but they're different. They have different tones to them. So that is because there's so many variables that come into play when you send your film to a lab. There's the person scanning your film. What do they like? The machine they're on. What are your preferences? All these different things come into play. So that's what we're going to talk about. So how do you find a good lab, right? I think this is kind of going to your question.
I wonder if you give some instruction about the contrast that one
Yeah.
that you get.
Yeah, absolutely. She's saying, can you talk to your lab? If you're working with a good lab, then absolutely, yeah. So I'll talk about my process that I work with my lab in just a second. But from baseline, when you're looking for a good lab, you want to look for a few things. First of all, you want to make sure you're working with a lab that is used to working with film photographers and processes a lot of film. That's because the chemicals that your film is processed in need to be fresh. They need to be good quality chemicals. You want to make sure that your film is being processed in really good equipment that is up to date. You don't want to get your negatives scratched or anything that can happen in bad equipment. It's happened to me. So you really want to make sure that the lab that you're choosing is used to working with film photographers and is used to working, processes a high volume of film. That's really important. And really, this is where it starts. It starts at the processing piece. I always tell people your negative is like a raw image, and you want to make sure you're creating the best possible negative. I mean, that's what it's all about. And then everything else is a variable. But make sure that your film is being processed properly by people who know what they are doing. You also want to make sure that you're working with a lab that has well-trained scan technicians. So scanning is the process where after your film has been developed and dried, they take your negatives, they run it through the scanner, and they take basically digital images of your negatives, and that's what you get back. You get this little digital image of your negative that you can then use however you would use a normal JPEG, which is wonderful. But the technician has a lot of control over how that scan looks, which is why they can look so different. There was a question in the back?
Is it a scan or is it a conversion?
It's a scan, or they call it a scan.
Is it a early scan or what is it?
We're going to get into the machines they use in just a second, and maybe that can answer your question. I'll show you. I'm not a scanner, so I don't know all the technicals, but I'll show you in just a second what the differences between the scanners. But one of the things that, here, we're going to talk about that in a second. So what do they do when they're scanning? How are they adjusting? Well, most professional labs, when they're scanning your image, they're going to scan for skin tone. They're going to make sure your skin tone looks good. Well, again, what does that mean? That's all subjective, right? So that's where, to answer your question earlier, that's where you do communicate with your lab. So I work with Richard Photolab. When I decided to work with them, I put together what's called a custom color profile. And we sat down over a period of months and went back and forth, where they would actually print out my negatives, and we'd talk about, well, what do you like about this? Well, what about these skin tones? We looked at all different kinds of skin tones. My favorites, my preferences, what film stock I was using, because again, that makes a difference if you're using a warm stock or a cooler stock, and we worked back and forth on that. Even with all of those variables, there's some play there, but they're always going to be scanning for the skin tones. Now, where that can become a problem, oops, sorry, my alarm's going off, telling me I have to pick my son up from school. Whoops, it's not going to happen. Somebody else will do that for me. But so what happens sometimes when you're in that scanning process and they're scanning from skin tones is then what do you do when people have two really different skin tones, right? That gets kind of tricky. So with the baby, this is the same baby in both of these images. This baby came into the studio and was a little jaundiced, which means there was a lot of yellow going on in her skin, which is pretty normal with newborns. But, you know, when the images were scanned for just the baby by itself, the lab was able to adjust for those skin tones by adjusting the colors, right? And you can tell that, you know, if you think of a color wheel and how it's opposite, that if you look at the whites in the diaper and in the blanket on this image, they're a little bluer because they were adjusting for that yellow. You see how that works? But then we went and put the baby with her super duper white brother. And he has a lot of blue already in his skin. So if they adjusted too much for her yellow, he was going to turn blue. Do you see what I'm saying? So this was a happy medium where she looks a little more jaundiced in this image than she does in her newborn ones, but that was, you know, the dance that they do. It's not like they have Photoshop and that they can go in and do it. It's all done in scan. Yeah?
I was actually just going to ask, do you ever bring it in Photoshop after and fix the skin tones even more, or is that like straight out of the lab, straight sent to the client?
Yeah, that's a great question. So she asked, like, do I ever Photoshop my stuff after, or do I just do straight scans? I personally pretty much never adjust my scans. Like, I've worked really hard and with Richard, really closely with Richard Photo Lab, so that my scans come in and they're exactly the way they want them. Because remember, if you were not here at the very beginning, but at the very beginning of the talk, I was like, I don't want to sit on the computer ever. I mean, that's like one of the reasons why I shoot film. I always say, like, one of my core values is laziness, right? Like, the less work I can do, the better. And so I personally don't. I know some people do, but I don't. Like, I think that that's acceptable. That was acceptable for me to do that. If it were a real case, like every once in a while there's just like, especially because I work with so many newborns, and so we do have this yellow baby problem from time to time. And I've just, you know, I'll convert them black and white before I'll go in and change color, which you can do. So anyway, that's one thing that those scan technicians are scanning for. They're scanning for those skin tones. They can also scan for highlights or shadows. And this is interesting when we go back to what we were talking about with metering. So you can meter for your highlights or shadows, but you can also scan for highlights or shadows. And it will change the look of your image a little bit. Now, sometimes I will meter for my midtones, and I'll tell my lab to scan for highlights, because I'm wanting a darker shadow, but I'm still wanting to make sure it's not underexposed, which I'm metering for those midtones, but I'm wanting a little more drama, so I'll have them scan for the highlights, or I'll have them scan for the shadows, depending on what I want. Usually in my work, I meter for the shadows, scan for the shadows when I'm using color film, and when I'm using black and white film, I'll meter for my midtones and scan for my highlights. Because I never want to have an underexposed negative, but sometimes I want a little extra drama, and so we can do that. Now, the other thing that goes on with scanning is the way it's scanned, to your question. So there are different professional scanners that a lab's going to use. You're going to have a Frontier scanner, and you're going to have a Noritsu scanner. And just like we were talking about before, about how some people are really passionate about Portra 400 and some people are really passionate about Fuji 400H, the same debate goes on with the scans. You're either a Noritsu person or you're a Frontier person. I personally am a Noritsu person, but the differences are subtle, but they are there. So let's just have a look at those real quick. So same negative scanned on two different scanners, right? Isn't that fascinating? So for me, Noritsu tends to be a little softer. There's differences in the magentas and there's differences in the black between the two. But isn't this interesting, the difference between Noritsus and Frontier? And here, I just did a couple of these so you could see. And it's a little different in the skin tones too, the contrast and all of that. And again, this is just a preference. So when you're working with a lab, there's a lot at play, right? Because you want to start communicating, this is the film I'm shooting. This is how I'm metering that film. This is what my preferences preferences are, I want these scanned for highlights or shadows. I want them scanned on a Noritsu or a Frontier. There's a lot that goes into play, which is why it's so important that you know all of this. So how do you find the right lab, right? Well, you start by doing your research. Again, kind of like what we were talking about, like how do you choose the right film stock for you? Look around, look at people who are shooting film, work you admire. Where do they go? Who are they using? Ask them. You'll start to see patterns, and it gives you a good place to start. I do recommend that you work with a professional lab. Like, don't take your film to a department store or whatever, even though they're still around. Again, you want good chemicals, you want well-trained technicians. It's really important. So do your research, visit their website. A lot of the labs, what's great about the film labs is that they all are so good at educating. So it really is fun to go to their website, read their blogs, ask them questions, see what they're sharing, and it gives you kind of an idea of the personality of the lab, which is good. Look at their work, like what kind of work do they produce? Is it consistent? Does it look the way you want your work to work? And then once you've figured all that stuff out, I tell people just to introduce yourself. Like, pick up the phone, give them a call, or send them an email and say, hey, I'm just starting this film journey. I'm sending you a bunch of film for the first time. I'm so excited to work with you. These are my preferences. This is what I'm doing. I would love any feedback. A lot of the film labs will give you feedback if you ask for it. Or they'll say, hey, these were a little underexposed, or you might want to try metering, making sure you're getting those shadows and all those things, which is nice. It helps you become a better photographer, which is great. And you also want to communicate with your lab. They're not mind readers. It's just a bunch of people, right? Just like us. So if you do have really strong opinions about the way you want your work to look, communicate that to them. They don't know that unless you tell them. And then once that's all been done, you want to keep those lines of communication open, because sometimes mistakes happen. Like I've been working with my lab for years. We know each other really well. I love them. They're like friends now. And every once in a while I'll get one that, like I said in my notes, scan for the highlights, you scan for the shadows, and we had that conversation and it's fine, and they redo it. But you just want to make sure that you're continuing to communicate, because sometimes what I see happen in the film community is that people will have one bad experience or get one batch back that they're unhappy with, and then they'll decide that that lab's not for them, and they'll get all over Facebook and talk about what a horrible lab it is. And it's like, well, did you call them and have a conversation about what went wrong? Maybe it was your fault. Maybe something went wrong in shooting. Maybe it was their fault. But you won't know unless you have the conversation. And a good lab will have that communication with you. They'll pull your negative. I've had work come back and I'd be like, what the heck happened? And they've been able to pull them out my negatives and look and say, well, you did something weird here. What's going on? Or, gosh, this was our fault. Let us redo it. I had one. I got an email a couple weeks ago, actually, where my lab sent me an email and said, hey, listen, you have 3 images in this roll that look underexposed, and that's not like you. What's going on? Check your equipment. Make sure everything's working, which is great that they can give me that feedback. So like I said, I work with Richard Photo Lab, and I've worked with them for a very long time. I believe them to be the gold standard. They're great. I can't recommend them enough. If you do decide to give them a try, tell them I said hello. And yeah, they're great. Richard Photo Lab is actually based in LA. And so I ship my film to California. Fun fact, owned by a guy named Brian. Right? There's a whole story about that. But we're really lucky. In the United States, we have a lot of really great labs. So like I said, Richard's my lab, but there's also Photovision in Oregon. They do fantastic work. There's the Fine Lab in Utah. There is the Goodman Photo Lab in California. There's Indie Film Lab down south. I mean, we have a lot of really great film labs. All of these labs I've used, which is why they're on my list. I would never recommend somebody I've never used, and they all do fantastic work.
A question. You are
Yeah.
based in the West Coast.
Yes.
Are there any good labs in the East Coast, or you don't really think it makes a difference? Like, did you pick those because they were closer to you?
No. So the question, so I'm from Seattle, yeah. Are there any good East Coast labs? I'm sure there are. The great thing is about film labs is that as film is making a comeback, we're seeing labs make a comeback too. When the digital thing happened, so many great labs went out of business, which was really sad. But now we're seeing them pop up everywhere. So there probably are that I'm just not aware of. But it doesn't, for me, it doesn't matter because I'm shipping it. So I can mail it to California or I can mail it to Utah, still mailing it. Different labs will have different turnaround times. So you want to reach out and ask the lab you're working at. If you're watching online and you're outside the United States, Canadian Film Lab used to be UK Film Lab, but then they moved to Canada, changed their name cleverly. And then there's Carmencita in Spain, also do really beautiful work. Yeah?
When you ship it, you talk about like temperature and stuff. Is there?
Dun da da! I'm like, wait, hold it. So how do you safely ship your film? That's a great question. So best practices for shipping your film, first of all, you want to keep it safe. Always ship it in a box, all right? Don't put it in an envelope and put it in where it can get squashed or ripped or wet or something like that. You always want to make it sure it's in a box. And what I do is I have little Ziploc bags and I put my film in the Ziploc bag with the order form because you put in your order online, you print out a little sheet that has your order number on it. I put that in with the bag, I Ziploc it, then I put it in a box. Then I tape the box like crazy, and then I send it out with tracking. You just I've heard so many horror stories about people losing film or the package shows up to the lab but the film's not in it, things like that. So just really make sure, use a box, tape your film, make sure it's somehow weather protected if for some reason that box gets dropped in a puddle or something, yeah. So any questions? Did that answer your question about how to ship it?
Yeah. I was also just gonna ask them, do they ship you back or anything?
That's a great question. So she asked at home. Yeah. So she was asking, what about the negs? You can choose how you want to handle that. So most labs will just send them back to you. Because I shoot such volume, I have them hold on to my negs until the end of the month, and then I get this big package in the end of the month. There's the option to have them dispose of the negatives, which people do. For me, I just can't. That just actually hurts my heart. But because that negative is, like I said, that's your raw file. That's like everything. So you want to make sure you're taking care of that neg. I do. At the end of the year, I offer them to my clients sometimes if they've bought the digital files.
They send the digital by how they send.
Oh, how do they get it? Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so once you send your film to the lab, they process it, they scan it, and then you get a digital copy. So for me, my lab sends me a zip file with high-res scans of all my images. That I then rename and upload for my clients. And I think, most labs send it that way via. I personally don't, but you can. Every once in a while I'll go in, I shouldn't say that, because if I have baby zits or whatever, I'll do that. I notoriously shoot crooked. I don't know what's wrong with my head, but so I'll I'll straighten every once in a while. But that's about it. I'm not going in and color correcting or doing any massive Photoshop. But you can. Once you get that scan, you can treat it just like you would any high-res scan. Every once in a while I do, but very little, because remember, I'm a lazy person, so I try not to. And then with storing your negs, so once you get your negs back, also you want to make sure that they're stored in a cool, dry place. Water, is going to damage a negative, sun's going to damage a negative. So you can get, actually from B&H, I ordered them these great acid-free boxes that you can fold everything in, and then you can write your date or your client name or however you want to archive them and keep them that way. There's lots of different ways to do it. Just make sure you keep them out of the sun and away from liquid. Any question about that lab piece? Yeah, yeah.
No, not necessarily lab. I'm
Oh, yeah.
excited about the next one.
Oh,
Next question. I have a lot of questions.
okay. Well, we'll save them for
That's
the
what I'm
end.
saying,
How's
I'm
that?
saving them.
Okay. Any questions specific to the lab piece that we were talking about? Yes.
What's the difference in cost between sending them digital images and sending them negatives to scan?
To sending your lab the negatives to scan. Oh, like if you have negatives that you want then scanned already, or.
No, I'm saying if you were shooting digital
Uh-huh.
instead of film.
Yes.
Okay. Would it cost you less to get the same end product from your lab than it does sending them negatives to scan?
Well, I suppose it would cost less if you're shooting digital, because what's happening when you're shooting film, as you're shooting film, you're sending it to the lab, they're processing, so that's a fee, then they're scanning and that's a fee. Whereas if you're shooting digitally and you're just sending your digital files and getting prints from your lab, that's just one step. So there's some more steps involved. For me, I feel like time is money. And so I shoot it in camera, I'm done, I send it to the lab, they know exactly what I want it to look like. I get those images back and I'm done. That's saving me all that time. So that little extra cost is worth it. And I also run a studio, so my budget's a little different. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You roll it into whatever your price is that you're charging and that sort of thing. Exactly. Yes.
So your end product to your clients is generally what?
And so she's asking if what my end product is to my client. So my clients, my sitting fee comes with a set of 4x6 proof prints, because I'm analog and I want people to see how pretty an actual print is. So they get, after I get my scans back, the lab, Richard Photo Lab, makes me a print of those files that I then wrap all pretty and we send to my client. And then they also get an online gallery. I use ShootProof. ShootProof is also linked to Richard Photo Lab, so if they order through the gallery, it's still going through my lab, so they know. They also work with Millers. They work with really great labs, so depending on who you work with. So that's what my clients get. They get an online gallery, and then they get a set of gift prints, 4x6 proof prints, and then I give the option of albums. I just have 3 choices, and digital files and prints. I have 2 different size prints, but I keep my offerings really small, just so I don't confuse people.
So ultimately, people will get prints.
Yes. Yeah. Most of my clients order, just about everybody orders an album. And my albums come with the digital files, so it's kind of the best of both worlds. So yeah, that's what they get. So real quick, the takeaway, and then I'm going to take some questions here. The takeaway from today, what I was hoping you would get out of this talk, this is an abbreviated talk to what I normally give, but I want you to know that film is actually pretty easy. It's really hard to mess up, especially a color negative, so don't be afraid of it, okay? You can overexpose it 6 stops, you're not going to lose anything. To be successful, you need to know your light, make sure you're metering properly and you're getting in and making sure that those dark shadows have enough light to them. So you want to err on the side of overexposure. You want to meter your color film for your shadows, right? You're going to meter for where you want your detail to be for your black and white. You're going to meter for your highlights or your midtones if you're using slide film, okay? Next thing is you want to know your film and which stock you're using, so do your research. Choose film stocks that meet your artistic vision, that have that look that you like, that you're going for. That's really important. And just have fun with it, experiment a little bit with it, take some risks. And the third part is really get to know your lab. Use a good lab, okay? They are your creative partner. They have a lot of influence over how your image looks at the end. So make sure you're working with a good one. And remember that as you learn, accidents happen, and that is okay. That's part of the fun. I love sharing this picture because I was like, I don't even know what happened here. Like, I'm not even sure how I did that. But somehow I did like a double exposure. There's light leaks. I mean, technically this is a disaster of an image, and I love it because I got both my kids in one frame. I'm not even sure. same roll. This was a hot mess, as you can see, but you know, got that light leak, total mistake, you know, but I love it. It's beautiful. So sometimes mistakes are really fun. Don't be afraid to take some risks, learn from your mistakes, and have fun, okay? That's my takeaway. If you want to follow me, if you want to see my film work, you can follow me on Instagram at Sandra Coan. And I also have a website that's devoted just to educational content for photographers, where I talk a lot about film. I have my blog post on my entire year of shooting Kodak film, how that happened, what I learned, all of that kind of stuff. And I also talk a lot about studio lighting, because I teach photographers how to create natural looking light with strobes and flash. And I teach film photographers how to do that as well. All right, you guys, so that's my talk. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
I needed to shoot Kodak.
Oh,
You
yes.
have not mentioned Kodak. What happened to Kodak?
Okay, so he was talking about Kodachrome, and now that song's going to be stuck in my head all day, just so you know. But what happened is Kodachrome was discontinued, along with the Ektachrome, when all that started happening, and they haven't brought Kodachrome back. I don't know if there are plans to bring that back, but if you like Kodachrome, you should try the Ektachrome. It's a little different, it's a little bluer.
Yeah, I should both.
Okay, well, go downstairs and get yourself some Ektachrome. It's so much fun, and it's so beautiful. But I'm not sure what their plans are for Kodachrome, but I'll ask. And then I'll share it in the stories, because apparently I'm calling Richard Photo Lab today, so I'll also call Kodak. Yeah.
While you were talking about the scanners, I looked at the Noritsu website, and it doesn't look to me like they are drum scanners.
Okay. She did some research. Noritsu is not a drum scan. I'm going to call Richard.
It looks like it's not.
I'm guessing it's not. I'm guessing it's not a drum. I mean, they're fancy scanners. The Noritsu and Frontier, they're pretty darn fancy. But I am going to call him, and I'll do a story today on Instagram, okay, to answer your question. Yes?
I know it's like finding your camera, but is there one that you think is a good place to start?
Yes.
Start a camera for like a beginner?
Yes. So the question is there a good beginner camera to start? I always tell people to start with a 35 millimeter, because it's not a huge investment. The 35 millimeter that I use, that I did the entire Ektachrome beta test on, you can get used probably downstairs for like $100. Yeah. So they're really not that big of an investment. The other great thing you want to think about is what system you're already using. So if you're a Canon shooter, I'm a Canon shooter when I shoot digitally. And so my film 35 millimeter is also Canon, because then I can use my glass already. I can just use the lenses, so you're not having to buy into a whole new system. So that might be something to think about as well. And then once you kind of get your feet wet with 35 millimeter, medium format's really fun. And one of the great things about film photography, you guys, is that cameras that used to be thousands of dollars, you know, like beautiful Hasselblads with Zeiss lenses, you know, all that good stuff, you can really pick up for very reasonable prices these days. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, which is fun. So then you can experiment a little bit and give it a try and see what you like. Yeah, I was actually just downstairs looking at all their used. It's like a candy shop, right? Like looking at all the pretty film cameras. So definitely go give it a try. Oh yeah.
When it comes to metering, are you using like a handheld meter, or do you have like an app on your phone that you use? I feel like, okay, because
Yeah.
I have one, and then I also have a couple apps on my phone.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I just can't trust the phone.
No, I wouldn't either. You just want to. I just wear it like a necklace. Oh, there goes my mic. But
You can't do incident reading.
yeah.
Apps, can you?
No, they're reflective. But there's some that you can get an attachment, like a little bulb that you can plug in. But yeah, they're super inconsistent. I would just get yourself, and like this one is used, I have a few of these, but the original one I got back in like 2002. But again, you can get, you know, used equipment for nothing. Oh, good.
Like when I'm out with my family, I tend to take a 35 millimeter too. But I always wondered if I should just take my handheld meter instead, because I was relying on my phone for some, and then they were getting.
Yeah, and then they look underexposed. Yeah.
Then I wasn't sure, because a lot of the film that I use is from my dad, who, you know, so old.
Yeah.
And my mother-in-law, she gave me a ton of cool film.
Oh, cool.
But I wasn't sure if
It could be a mix of both, especially if it's really old film. So if you do have a stash of old film that somebody gave you, um, it will start to lose sensitivity the older it gets. And so with older film like that, just make sure you're really giving it a lot of extra exposure. So you want a meter for your shadows and then maybe give it an extra stop of exposure just so it has enough time to get all that light. Yeah, definitely. Oh, wait, I'll go here and then I'll go here. Wait, see.
So you used to shoot digital? You did that, but you never
I
shot
did.
digital?
No, I did. And I do.
But you did. So then how is the transition? Like, because when you shoot digital, you can take 500
Mhm.
pictures in a session, and that's an hour.
Mhm.
How do you refrain from that?
That's a
Get
great question.
36, well, and it's a
Or
35
12, yeah.
Or 12. So like, how do you decide, or how do you, yeah, that's. okay.
Yeah, so the question is, how do you make that transition from digital back to film? It feels really weird at first. I mean, honestly, and I had a background in film photography, and then I spent about 5 years shooting exclusively digitally, kind of hating it the whole time. But, you know, I kind of alluded to this at the beginning of my talk, like I shoot differently as a digital photographer. And one thing that I would do, which I think a lot of people do, is when I had my digital camera, as soon as somebody walked through the door, I was just shooting, feeling like kind of frantic, like I had to get every frame and every shot and every expression. And so going to a system that was much slower, where I was missing smiles from time to time, where I was missing an interaction, was kind of freaked me out for a little bit. And I just had to like get used to the process. And now I'm super zen about it, and I feel like it actually changed the energy of my sessions, because now I'm no longer like racing and it doesn't feel frantic, and I'm not giving that frantic energy out. Now it's like just really calm and I'm in control, and if I miss a smile or if I miss something, there'll be another one. It's fine. It's not like children only smile once in an hour, you know? So you just kind of give yourself time and just allow yourself to feel uncomfortable, like anything that's new. And then the other thing I recommend for people who are wanting to transition is start slow. You know, start with one roll a session and practice, you know, and then move up to 2 rolls and then kind of see where you go. Because before you know it, it becomes the new normal. You get used to not looking at the back of your camera, you know, and it feels good. Like for me, not having that distraction, I'm a little ADD, you know, but now that I don't even have that option, I'm just connecting with my people, which, let me tell you, especially with working with little kids love that. If you're actually like connected for an entire hour watching them, like you'll be amazed of how it changes the energy and the dynamics of your session. Is that super woo-woo sounding?
No, that's good. I kind of love the idea that it's not so frantic.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly how I get to a thing. And
Yeah,
I'm like,
you're like, gotta get all the
I gotta
things.
catch it.
Yeah, and
And
we even had this thing happen on my session on Saturday before I flew into New York, where I had a newborn and a toddler. And we had done the newborn photos. I'd brought the toddler in, and the toddler was getting done wasn't real excited about the baby. And I finished my roll after 16 shots, and as I was changing out my roll, the toddler got to go have some goldfish crackers, play a little bit. Like, it's like a built-in break that we all need. And then when I'm ready, I'm like, hey friend, let's do 2 more, and then I'm gonna give you like 1,000 stickers. And he's like, okay. But so it's kind of this nice flow to it, which I appreciate for my work.
How many rolls do you typically, like, I don't know how long a session is.
Mm-hmm.
An
An hour.
An hour. So how many rolls do you typically expect to?
That's a great question. So she's asking, how many rolls do I shoot? I shoot 120, and I'm getting between 12 to 16 exposures per roll, and I will take 3 to 4 rolls a session.
Okay.
Yeah. So not a ton. My clients get, usually on average, around 30 to 40 images in their gallery. Yeah, and then they're not overwhelmed. It's like the whole thing is just better for everybody, right? I think. What was your question?
Okay, my question is related to the scan.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have a photo, people request a print. You always request the lab to print it for you, or you print it yourself. Or the second part of the question, what's the result? If you print the result from your scan, and
from the negative?
How much difference?
That's a great question. So he's asking about when I'm printing, am I printing from the digital scan or from the negative? I print mine from the scans. And the reason for that is, first of all, I'm working with a really good lab. I have really good scans. They're huge. They're a good size, scanned off that negative. And then they have come to me and I have straightened them, right? Because I shoot everything a little bit crooked. I have them exactly the way I want, and then I order those prints from those files. And the lab is set up to do that as well. Again, I'm going to have to call them again. I know that there's always the capability to print off a negative. That's fine. I think it's more industry standard, however, for labs to print off of the scan, because they're all set up to do that now anyway, as opposed to printing off a negative.
That's my 30 years experience when I shooting this so long.
I know, right?
Now it's updated.
It's all different.
Yeah.
I totally feel your pain, because it's like you have to relearn it all again, which I did, and it feels weird even though it shouldn't, because you have this history with it, but you should just do it. You're going to have the most fun.
I know.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions? Yeah.
It's about the measuring the light. When I always try myself with a pen, or this I will overexpose, or depend on
Yeah.
ice.
Uh-huh.
But if I have a question, if I go, suppose I want more detail, it's a black white,
Mhm.
I want more detail in some part that is the shadow.
Okay.
If I go with my camera, there.
Oh,
this
like
part-
spot meter?
Yes.
Mhm.
And like spot meter, and measure this, and keep this measure to do. You think it's worth?
Yeah, so she's asking about metering, and if she wants to use her in-camera meter, can she spot meter for those dark shadows
Instead, I use
instead of
the-
using a handheld light meter? Absolutely, you can. If that is working for you, you're going to get more accurate readings, however, using incident reading, just because that spot meter, that's a reflective meter. So it is going to matter what skin tone you're photographing, what they're wearing. There's a lot more variables at play. What I love about incident is it's always the same. It's just metering that light that's falling on them. So you could have two people, one person in black, one person in white, standing right next to each other in the same light. You're going to get the same reading, which I just like. It's
Or
just
if I
easy.
have a gray card, I go in the
Yeah,
shadow.
you could get a gray card and get it in there, and that would work too. But if you're already going up there with a gray card, then just
I
use an
can,
incident
yes.
reading.
Not,
I know. Yeah, but you can. I mean, yeah, reflective. People love reflective metering, and of course, it makes more sense too to use reflective if you're doing landscapes or something far away. Absolutely. But yeah, I like instant readings personally. Yeah.
So with the Rolleiflex, you're not able to switch lenses out or anything like that?
I have, so she's asking about my Rolleiflex and do I miss not being able to shift out my lenses or change them out. I have little filters for my Rolleiflex so that I can put them on so I can have like a little macro ability so I can get closer, which is nice. They do, and they sell them here. So yeah, I can go down there with you and we can look afterwards, but they're great. So sometimes you'll see on my Instagram where I'll have a black and white image, the square that I've taken on the Rolleiflex, but it's really close. And that's how I've done it, is I use those filters. And there's you can buy different ones for different magnitude, just so you kind of can change out your lens. Yeah, it's great. Yes, ma'am.
Cameras. I know digital cameras are constantly getting better and sensors involved. Is it the same with film camera, or can I take my old one from 20 years ago?
Yeah, just take your old one. She's like, as far as like technology, they used to build film cameras to last forever. I mean, that's the great thing. And then people would invest in their lenses. That's how it used to be done. So yeah, I mean, I have cameras that I have my Rolleiflex that was built in the 50s that I still use. Yeah, and I love it. I have a Hasselblad 503 that's super old. I have all my cameras are old because they're film.
No, it's good to know, because this way if I go and I take the camera and I take a bunch of pictures and they don't come out good, I know I'm not blaming the camera.
No. And there are some things that can go wrong with your camera. Your shutters can be broken. You can get light leaks, all those kind of things. But for the most part, you don't have to. That's a great thing too. You invest in a camera, and then you keep it. You're done. Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah, great questions, you guys. I mean, oh wait, we have another question. Yeah.
So this is a kind of strange question. I took a course last year at ICP, at a darkroom, black and white darkroom course, and the instructor
Fun.
Taught us that, was trying to teach us that box speed, ASA, ISO on black and white film is not accurate. That the real ISO of a speed, the true one to get the best details in the highlights and your shadows, is half the box speed, generally.
Yeah.
With the 3200 films, it's about 1,000. So you've heard of this?
I've heard of this, and actually I had a whole bunch of slides in about this, and I was like, this is the beginning course, I'm going to take it all out.
You just
But
process it differently. You process it for 80% of the full.
like I said, right, like one of my core values is laziness. I don't want to do too much work. I feel like, and I've actually had this very conversation with my friends at Kodak. We've had this conversation because there's this big belief in the film world that you rate your film speed something other than box speed, right? And in theory that makes sense because you're adding a little usually overexposure to it. But I've personally have never felt that it is helpful to the extent that people say it's helpful.
Right.
If you're wanting to make sure you have detail in your shadows, this is going to give you detail in your shadows, and then you're also not robbing yourself of a stop of exposure. When you're stuck at a certain ISO and you're stuck at 400, every stop is precious.
Right.
And if you then take a 400 speed film and rate it at 100 or 200, you've just taken a stop of exposure away from yourself. Which, why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, I understand a lot of people say that. And my Creative Live class, 7 hours of this, and I go into detail about rating and why. I personally don't think you need to do it. I think it's just easier and more consistent if you just rate it at box speed and make sure you're metering for those shadows. It's the same thing happening. Yeah, only you have more control. Yeah, but so many people say that. So no disrespect to your instructor. Any other questions, you guys? Anything else? Well, thank you so much for being here today and let me totally geek out about this because I love film so much. Please go out and shoot a bunch of it and then tag me in all your photos when you post them on Instagram so I can see. Okay?